In this episode of Love Leadership, we're going to be talking about being called to leadership. Welcome to episode 1 of Love Leadership, where we exist to build up leaders who love to lead and lead to love. I'm here with Todd Doxzon today. Episode 1, here we go. Can you believe it, man?
It's been a long time coming. Been waiting for this.
Totally, man. And so today's cool because we are kicking off a 5-part series.
Yep.
Where we're gonna be talking about the 5.
Could be 8. You never know.
Could be 8. You never know.
Yeah.
But we're gonna be talking about the 5C's of leadership.
Yep.
And today's cool because we're gonna be talking about being called to leadership. But before we do that, can you just give us an overview on why we're even talking about these things today?
Well, I tell you, Mike, when you're called to lead an organization, quickly you realize it can't be done by yourself.
Totally.
And we actually get our this text in Exodus 18. It really hits home, and I'll just give you kind of the idea. Moses was talking about leading an organization. We're talking about a couple million people organization. Yeah. Talk about a big organization, and he's trying to do it on his own. I mean, and his father-in-law Jethro comes and says, "Bro, you got to pump the brakes on this. You got to figure something out." He says clearly, you're going to wear yourself out, and you're going to wear the people that you're leading out as well. Totally. And he gives him such good wisdom. He gives him this piece of advice, and he says, what you need to do, you need to select capable people, and then you need to delegate that authority to groups. These leaders are going to oversee 1,000. They're going to oversee 100, 50, and 10. So different capacity levels of the leadership there as well. And so in any event, that's kind of the idea. And so for us as an organization, we're always looking and we're praying through how can we continue to build leaders and add to this team capable leaders so we can continue to move forward in what we're called to do. We can't do it on our own.
Exactly.
We got to be able to, prayerfully consider who is going to be added to this team to lead well.
And when I think about this idea of leadership and even just the idea of burnout, I think a lot of our listeners, those of you that are leaders, have experienced burnout or on your way to burnout. For sure. And we saw that with Moses here. What would you say are just some things that prohibit us from empowering those around us?
Man, there's a lot of them, Mike. One of them I'll honestly say is identity. And here's what I mean by that. A lot of times leaders love the limelight. They love that someone has to come to them. In the story, really, Moses, there's an area of it. He tells Jethro, he's like, well, the people have to come to me. I give them direction. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's intoxicating as a leader, because if you have lack of identity and you need to be known or you need to be someone, all of a sudden these people are coming to you for the answers. And it's kind of like, oh, I kind of like that. They have to come to me. The problem with that, though, is then all of a sudden you have a long line of people that are having to come to you. And, again, it turns into burnout over time. So sometimes it's pride, it's insecurity, lack of identity. Sometimes it's control. If I'm honest with you, man, one of the things I love about you, Mike, is you really get me. You get, number one, you get God's heart. You get the heart of the organization, and you get me. You know me so well. And so I could send you somewhere, and I know, you're going to represent the Lord, number one. You're going to represent the organization. You're going to represent me as a person, and that gives me comfort. Well, sometimes, man, it's scary, because when you delegate authority, then all of a sudden someone goes out and they're representing the organization. That's true. And so sometimes it's control, really. Absolutely. And so Craig Groeschel, obviously we talk about him all the time and what an influence he's been to us. And he talks about, man, if him and Andy Stanley both to talk about, if you have someone that can do, the job half as good as you, get rid of it. Yeah, totally. And don't you love what he said? That's scary, man. I don't know about that.
And don't you love Craig? He'll say, you can have control or you can have growth, but you can't have both. Yeah, and that's so good, right? Yeah. And so really that's the key here. And that's why we're talking about this, is because our best is for every person that tunes into this Really the motivation of why you and I are having this conversation is so that we as leaders can grow. We can grow together in community.
That's right.
Because God has more for us individually, but he also has more for us as an organization.
That's right.
And if we're unwilling to grow as leaders and really understand this concept that you're talking about, our growth will be stifled, right?
For sure.
And so that kind of segues us into like the first one we're going to talk about today, which is being called, which is a big thing. Can you just tell a little bit of your story on how you were called?
Well, I tell you, Mike, before I even tell that story, I was at a pastor's conference years ago, and there's this old pastor, his name Gail Irwin, and had suspenders, just hilarious. He was like a stand-up comedian pastor, and he gave a talk, and afterwards there was like a Q&A time, and a young guy got up and he said, "Hey, how do I know I'm called to be a pastor?" And Gail, I'll never forget this, Gail said, "Well, I'll tell you what, try to do anything else you can in this world and be fulfilled, and if you still can't, then you know you're called to be a pastor." And his point was, I loved it because now being 12 years into ministry, 12, 13, 14 years into ministry, if you're not called to this thing, man, this is not what you want to be in. And it doesn't matter. It could be ministry, it could be marketplace, it could be coaching, a variety of different things. A parent, I mean, if you're not called to it and you try to jump into something you're not called to, you'll get gassed so quick and you'll miss out in life. And so that's where it started for me. But then my personal story is a little bit more advanced, and that was, it began with my conversion to Christ, if I'm really honest.
Totally.
And my story, man. I was, I had just gotten cut by the New York Jets. I kind of hit rock bottom. I was waking and baking and fornicating is kind of how I describe it, man.
Totally.
And I was in my truck. I was delivering a Jimmy John sandwich and a bag of weed at the same time, man. And this is late 97. So, golly, what is that? Over 2 decades ago. And God just really, he captured my heart. I was in my truck driving, and I felt the very presence of God. I know that sounds kind of weird to maybe some of our listeners, but that's the reality of what happened.
Yeah, that's your story.
That's my story. And it was, Mike, it was a supernatural shift in my soul is how I describe it, because the last thing in the world I could see myself doing is what I'm doing today.
Totally.
But God intervened in my life, and there was a point in my life where he said, man, you can continue down the same road, or you can accept my forgiveness and start following me. And that's where it started for me. This whole called to be a pastor, called to lead Love Church, this organization. It started way back then, man.
Totally, that's
and it
crazy.
Was a shift, major shift to my soul.
Major shift, man.
Yeah.
And so there's a supernatural shift that occurred.
Yeah.
But then another thing that you'll talk about is a divine directive.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing: we're all on this journey. It's a process as a leader. Mm-hmm. There may be some listeners today that are saying, "Man, I'm growing as a leader, but I'm not fully alive in the place I'm at." And God started your journey in your truck. But along the process, there were these moments, and I think there's even a story maybe you can tell from the Bible that connects this idea of divine directive.
Well, it is the story in the Bible that probably best parallels my story is the story of Paul when he went from Saul to Paul. And in Acts chapter 9, he's on his way to Damascus. At this time, he's a Christian killer. I mean, he's going out and grabbing Christians and bringing them back in chains, and he hated it. He was a good Jewish, leader, and he thought that Christianity was a cult, which I don't blame him.
Yeah,
he could have at that time. And but man, on his way to Damascus, he has this encounter with God. I would say it was his supernatural shift, and then he had a divine directive, and it was to share the gospel, to share Christ, and it was very similar to what happened in my story. After I came to Christ, Mike, I ended up signing with the New England Patriots. They sent me to Amsterdam, of all places. I
don't know how you survived that,
God
bro.
growing me there, and obviously had some amazing investment in my life while I was over there. But it was probably mid-season, and I blew out my knee. I was running this seam route, caught it. Kurt threw a pick. And the safety picked it off, and I went to go tackle him, and some other guy took out my knee, blew out my MCL, and went back from Amsterdam, flew to Birmingham, Alabama, and was rehabbing my knee and got invited to this church. And after church one day, I was just praying kind of in the front of the church, and I felt this overwhelming call to ministry. And, it was very specific. It was, Todd, I'm going to use you to reach many, many of your friends and your family for my sake.
Crazy.
And that was way back then. And, throughout the time, there was other determining and kind of clarifying factors. But that was one of the stories I remember most clearly of this just divine directive. Like, I'm calling you to full-time vocational ministry. And it probably was the last thing I wanted to do, man, but it was something you can't run from. It's kind of like Jonah in the Bible. You can try to run from it, but he's going to continue to bring it back to you.
Totally. And so, for some of our listeners, they might be saying, well, and we even talked about not everybody's called to vocational full-time ministry, right? I mean, some people are called to be killing it in the marketplace, coaches, teachers, stay-at-home parents. And so, but the thing I want to ask you is, how do we know that we're called?
Yeah. Well, golly, Mike, there's a variety of ways I could go with that. First of all, if you're a Christian and you're listening to this, we're all in full-time ministry.
Totally.
And there's just different places that God sends us. Because the fact is, God's a God of love. He's created us for a love relationship. And he wants to spread all of us out as missionaries throughout the whole world. And so it could be church ministry, nonprofit, it could be marketplace, wherever. So I would just say, number one, we're all called as Christians. If you're not a Christian, you're on your way. The fact is, the way I believe it, is God still has created with certain gifts and abilities and talents to bring value to an organization. And the fact is, we're better together.
Totally.
How do I know specifically? Man, it is kind of a journey. Mm-hmm. Again, for me, my main calling was in this whole area of self-feeding, was training people to go through the Bible on their own. That was a specific, I call it a calling that I was called to. And so that aligned with what I was called to. There's a variety of there's different people have different calls, different woes. Another guy, I'll just give an example, Dabo Sweeney, right? Yeah. He was specifically called to coaching, and then God opened up this door in Clemson, right? And so here he is, an amazing leader in the football world. How does he know? I imagine that he had something deep in his heart, that he had this conviction. He knew that this was the direction that he was called to.
Totally. And you know, when I hear you talk about this concept, you also connect our calling to the fruit that's being produced in our life, which I think can be sometimes the evidence of whether or not we're actually called to that, right? I mean, if we're walking into the place God has called us every day with a bad attitude, right, we're probably creating a terrible environment in that place. But ultimately, the thing that God has called us to, there should be some fruit in our life, don't you think?
Yes and no. I would say the way I see it, God calls us to something, and our number one response is to be faithful. And so you can make a case. Jeremiah in the Bible, I mean, the guy was faithful to his calling. Wasn't a whole lot of fruit, as we would term it from a pastoral standpoint. At the same time, though, Paul the apostle would be the opposite of that. He was called to this specifically, and I'm telling you, through his ministry, all kinds of people came to Christ, and it was talk about mad fruit, crazy. So I would say yes and no. As I continue to move forward in my life, and I'm genuine to the call, that's what I've experienced. I've seen not just outward fruit, but even inward fruit. Yeah. When I'm aligned to my calling and I'm obedient to what I really feel invited into, I feel like there's peace within my soul. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, but I want to lean into that for a second.
Yeah.
Because even when I initially asked the question, I think it's so cool how we worked from like surface to inside.
Yeah.
And I think that's because we can argue that, Jeremiah, there was no external fruit, but the reality is when we're walking in the thing that God has created us for, I think there's a peace and a joy that comes, right? that doesn't match up with circumstances. You've maybe even experienced that in your own life.
Well, you and I have talked about this before. Being called doesn't necessarily translate to being comfortable.
That's it, yeah.
And Jeremiah's a perfect example. I mean, the guy was ostracized. He was attacked. I mean, Paul the apostle, same type thing. I've been in seasons of my life and my calling where, I've wanted to tap out. It was extremely painful. You deal with all kinds of different people at different seasons of life. You deal with tragedies all the time. There's a lot of stuff in our call that's not comfortable at all, but deep inside, you feel like I'm being obedient to the call. So there is a peace deep in your soul.
Totally.
And I would go to the marketplace person. There's sometimes where we're outside of our call, chasing something that's not necessarily we're pre-programmed for. So I might have a lot of outwardly fruit and possessions and power and all that kind of stuff, but something's not quite right in my soul. There's a disconnect in my soul. And a lot of times I think it's because we're disconnected from our call. Number one, again, I'm putting the pastor hat on, is coming to Christ, living in this beautiful relationship with God. But also, man, like I really believe He's created us pre-programmed for a purpose. And when we're disconnected from that, I think there is a lack of peace.
I think about how the discovery process, a lot of times when we talk about calling, we talk about, like what we're doing. And I think a lot of times God wants us to discover who we are. And a lot of times that's a process and it's a journey. And I just think
it's an ongoing journey.
Yeah, it's an ongoing journey. And I think that, there's some people that may be a bit discouraged because they're maybe not walking in that thing that they know they're created for. How would you speak to maybe the young leader that's in a season where they're called to be faithful with little? They're called to be faithful in this season where they don't really feel like they're coming alive in their particular role, but God is using that to set them up for what He has for them.
It's a great question, I think, and we'll get into this when we get into the consistency part, Mike. But faithfulness behind the scenes, I think, is such a major thing. And what I've seen in my life is it's an ongoing process. You mentioned that. And all along the way, in my calling, God has brought me through different seasons, and each season has prepared me for the next.
That's it.
And, I had some of the best advice ever given to me before we left Fort Lauderdale to start the church over 11 years ago. And it was our pastor's wife. And she said, enjoy the journey. Enjoy the journey. Because you're called to start this church. You're called to this movement in Omaha. But if you're only focused on the call and what's next, and we got to build this, and we miss the joy of the journey, not only what He's doing in you, but just enjoying life around you. I mean, when we started the church, the kids were 6 years old.
Totally.
If I would have just kept on thinking, okay, well, one day we're going to do this, and one day we're going to get the building built, and all right, we'll see you later, kids. It's like, then I'm missing it. But, what I would say to the 22-year-old or, the person that is in process and they can see they have vision, but they're still in process, I would just say, man, enjoy the journey. Be faithful to what He's entrusted you to right now. And a lot of the lessons and a lot of the equipping is going to be going on in the journey. And so have vision, but don't be so aloof that you miss today.
Totally. And so I want to segue off of that because I think, as I think about this concept of being called and calling, I think about how it's easy for a leader to be called to something. And as they step into it, we talked about this just a moment ago about how our calling can be uncomfortable, right? And so it's easy as a leader to disqualify ourselves because we feel like we're not qualified for the particular role. Yeah. So how do we persevere through that?
Well, the whole adage, God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. Totally. And that looks good on paper, but if I'm really honest with you, when we came to obey this calling, I didn't know what the heck I was doing, Mike. I mean, I had like some, how would I call it, fire hose preparation down in Fort Lauderdale. You're doing weddings and funerals and counseling and you're preaching and this and that, but until you jump into it, God's grace, though, along the way is the beautiful thing that I've seen. And God's grace is through resource, right? Financial resource, human resource. Look at you guys. I mean, look around in our team. I mean, I met you in Mexico.
It's crazy.
And you're out in LA and God sovereignly calls you here. I could go on and on. Kappas I meet him down in Florida at Patmos and God sends him here. Luis, when he first got here. Another Cali guy, But you look throughout the process of God building this organization, this church, it's beautiful to see His grace through the process.
Exactly. And, when I relate to my own story, I think faith is such a key component to this whole walk. I think there's something exhilarating about being in that place of man, I don't really know how to do this. I don't really know what's next. But I think as much as it can be exhilarating, it can also be extremely uncomfortable. But we gotta continue to step, right? The picture I got was we were walking the beach in Mexico about a month ago. Saw a little kid playing, creating a kiddie pool right next to the ocean, right? The picture God, spoke to me is there comes a point in life where you've got to move from the kiddie pool on the side of the beach to the ocean, right? Because just that God has so much more for us. But so many people stay stuck in fear or this idea of feeling like they're not enough, or I don't know what's next, so I'm not going to step. But it really does require faith to fulfill what God's called us to.
Yeah, there's no question. And let me just add this too, Mike, because I might be thinking about a listener that goes, well, how do I know what I'm called to? And I usually give 2 questions to young people when they're kind of prayerfully considering that. Number 1, what freaks you out? What drives you insane?
Yep.
And number 2, when do you feel most alive? And I like those 2 questions. I read this book by Max Lucado a long time ago. It really helped me tremendously figure out my purpose. And I like starting with number 1. What drives you insane? So in other words, my life won't be purposeful unless I provide a solution for this. And for me, again, it was a lot of Christians that, they go to church 1.8 times a month, but they never get to know God in their own Bibles. That was something that I could not live with, right? You go through a variety of different things that people have. They're called woes. And then the flow, right, is what am I most alive in? When am I going downhill? And that's what I would say to some of our young listeners. Just kind of explore that. Because oftentimes those 2 questions, the answers to those questions, will give you some pretty good indication as to, what you're called into.
That's so amazing. And so I want you to put your organizational leader hat on now for a second. And I want to ask you, how vital is it? Because we have a lot of organizational leaders that are listening. But how vital is it that you, as a leader, build a team around you of folks that are called to the mission of the organization?
Well, it's a non-negotiable for us. I mean, because here's the deal, what we do isn't for everybody, unless you're inside a church, you don't really know it, but you got to be all in. It can't be like, I love church, but, I love this, but it's got to be, man, no, I know I'm called to this, and through thick and thin, I'm in, and when you have that, it just creates a lot of unity, a lot of synergy, a lot of power, and you have people, I got your back, you got mine. We're in this together for the long haul. Let's go.
Yeah, it's so good. And, seasons are just a part of life. Seasons change. Seasons come and go.
Yep.
And I think communication is such a vital piece, because there may be a listener that's listening right now that says, you know what, I'm discovering through this podcast right now that I'm not called to the organization that I'm a part of.
Sure.
How would you encourage that person to handle, and we'll just wrap up with that question.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that, Mike. Yeah. And you're right, you hit it. Seasons. There's different seasons, man. But I love honesty. I love transparency. Mike, if you came to me and you're like, hey, man, this has been an amazing ride. This is what I feel God doing in my heart. And you know what? I've always said, I got an open hand, man. God sends people. He sends them away. But I think it's best for the organization and the individual to be very transparent and open, because then you have a win-win situation, and you can move forward together. Even when you move in separate ways, you're still unified, because you're honoring one another. You're honoring the organization and the individual.
That's so good. Man, come on, somebody. That's so
fun.
Cool. That was awesome. Episode 1 called of a 5-part series talking about the 5 C's of leadership. Man, hope you were blessed by today. We got better together today, and hopefully you did as well. We would just encourage you guys to like this podcast, comment on it, share it with your friends. We just want to continue to build community, a community of leaders that want to love to lead and lead to love. So we can't wait to see you guys next time.